Our next interviewee will be Professor Jens Walter, a senior investigator at APC Microbiome Ireland, and he will speak on the topic of dietary fibre as a food for microbes.
So dietary fiber are carbohydrates, so essentially complex sugars that escape the digestion in our small intestine and then reach the colon. And some of these dietary fibers, they are utilized by the microbes, that colonize our gastrointestinal tract. I think that's a fair statement. Yeah, the microbes have to live on something. They have to eat. Yeah, they need resources for their energy and growth. And some, as I said, some fraction of fiber or fermentable dietary fiber are in fact utilized and are one of the main, sources of food for our microbes in the gut. Yeah, examples would, for example, be beta-glucans that you find in your roll oats or arabinoxylans that you find in, a lot of your vegetables. But there are also things like resistant starches and many other forms. There's actually hundreds of different varieties that you find in primarily plants, fruits, vegetables, beans, nuts. So these are good sources of fiber. So we're getting some really good information, from scientific research, that we are really essentially starving the microbial populations if we eat a fiber, low of our refined diet with, I would say quite significant, detrimental consequences. Yeah. For example, what happens is that the microbes, because they have nothing to eat, they turn against the mucus layer, degrade the mucus layer, and by this they jeopardize the integrity of our intestinal lining. Another, what I find very interesting aspect is that if you don't give fiber to microbes, they actually increase their proteolytic fermentation, which then results in metabolites, that are toxic or carcinogenic, which then, has other detrimental consequences. So Nutritional and Health Organization recommend different numbers, around 25 grams for females and up to 38 grams for males. Yeah, but it's different depending on who you ask. But it's definitely between 25 and 38 grams. Yeah. So this is an aspect of I'm highly fascinated about in my own research. As humans, we have roamed for millions of years through the African savanna, eating diets, with substantially higher amounts of dietary fiber than what we eat and even what we recommend. So we think actually that our ancestors probably ate in the excess of 100 grams of dietary fiber, which is an interesting aspect, to consider if you think about your own nutrition, that actually evolutionary, we are actually adapted to diets with much, much higher levels of dietary fiber. I think nutritional diversity is probably, something one should recommend. Yeah, it also makes sense from an, microbial ecological perspective. Because if you eat different fibers, that means you provide a diversity of substrates to your microbes, which actually, in theory, and there's some evidence that this is true, would also allow you, to maintain a higher diversity of microbes in your gut. So proteins and lipids are digestible. So most of them are absorbed, but there's always a small proportion. Digestion isn't perfect. There is always a small proportion, that reaches the colon. So and there is probably not as well researched as fiber, but there's some interesting research that plant proteins are actually healthier or better for your microbiome than, for example, proteins from red meat. On the other hand, also in lipids, there is evidence that saturated fats are actually more detrimental, than polyunsaturated fats and omega-3 fatty acids, for example. So there is, scope to actually look also at other food components and how they interact with your microbiome, if you want to, eat healthy. Oh, I do really enjoy the dietary advice that an American author, and I think his name was Michael Palin, he gave dietary advice in 7 words. And it is: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And I do actually agree, because I'm not a big supporter of, these kind of very restrictive dietary guidelines, cut out carbohydrates or cut out fat or something. I am not sure. And then in the nutritional, sciences, there's huge controversy around these advice. But I think there's really good advice that you make your food staples, vegetables and fruits, make this almost half of your diet. And then it's and, of course, then cut out, ultra processed foods and, processed meats and things. But then the occasional lean steak is probably even beneficial then, if you make sure, that the bulk of your food is actually vegetables and fruits. It's a hot topic in the nutrition world at the moment, that so there actually, I think it started in Brazil, that the guidelines there used what is called the NOVA guideline. So it grouped foods into four classes based on the level of processing. And the most processed category is these ultra processed foods, which are considered detrimental. There is quite some controversy around the specifics of these ultra processed foods, but I do think it's a step in the right direction, because there is good evidence that these ultra processed foods are just, they are very high in calories. They are full of nutrients like salt, fat, sugar that we don't really want. They don't provide the reward, kind of signals to the brain, that other foods. So you actually start to just overeat. And then we have good evidence, that they're not so good for your microbiome either, because they have, again, too much sugar that feeds microbes in the small intestine, and then compounds such as emulsifiers, for which we have some evidence that, again, they degrade the mucus layer. So I think, again, there's more research needed, and I think perhaps, more kind of nuanced criteria. But overall, I do think it's an important concept.